Do you think there should be regulation? Why should, given the challenges that we are facing, should there be no regulation at all? How do we deal with this?
To clarify your question, I presume you mean should there be government regulation? So here's the thing, I have like 3 points to make on this. One is there is already a lot of excessive government regulation. The IT Act still stands as, 69A is still applicable, plus you have all the laws of the IPC like 295A and 153A which clamp down on free speech. So there, online players like players anywhere, users everywhere, all these laws still apply to them. The second point is that, look, government is not this wise, benevolent entity which, if it regulates, will solve all our problems. Giving government the power to regulate essentially gives one set of interest groups extra power in a situation where they already have the power imbalance on their side. And that absolutely doesn't make sense. In a democracy, you need the playing field of information in the marketplace of ideas to be as level as possible. If you have regulation, you have one set of interest groups with much more power in their hands, and that's never going to end well. And even if government did not have that tendency, the point is you will always have regulatory capture, which you've seen in any kind of regulation. You have regulatory capture by special interests, and that again is harmful for civil society. And the third point I'd like to make is that, look, I think we make a mistake when we talk of regulation, we either talk of government regulation or self-regulation. The way I look at it is that self-regulation is an outcome of the only true kind of regulation, which is competition. So whether you call it the market or civil society or whatever, that itself is a regulatory force. Now, it's not a panacea. Sure, we face lots of problems with fake news and so on, but government regulation is the wrong solution, and it would actually make things much worse. That's my case.
Haven't we seen a failure of market forces in this case then? Fake news in particular. I think and also hate speech.
Look,
the same things that protect our speech, that protect our anonymity and our privacy, have also been weaponized against us.
It's number one, when you talk of market failure, you ignore government failure. Government failure is ubiquitous. You give government the power to do anything, it will mess it up. Number two is not exactly a market failure, it's the opposite. The thing is, the proliferation of fake news, what it does is that it reveals this human tendency to create these imagined realities and cater to them. So actually, it's not a market failure, it's a market working in ways that is harmful for democracy and that you and I may not be happy with. But I wouldn't call it a market failure, and I'd say that bringing the government into this with the necessary ensuing government failure will only make things worse.
Okay, Govind, you've operated in an industry where there has been government intervention, which is TV in particular. You did print as well. So has government regulation helped keep things sane? What are the pressures that you faced? Why did you go online? How do you deal with that regulatory imbalance between the two?
So roughly 10 years ago, we are in 2018 now, so about 2008, late 2008, early 2009, after the terror attacks in Bombay, the Information and Broadcasting Minister of the time, Anand Sharma, called all the TV broadcasters into a room in Delhi and basically said, what the hell have you guys been up to? The specific reference was obviously the way channels were broadcasting visuals from the attack and the rescue operations that were being attempted, in turn broadcasting to people sitting in Karachi as to what was happening, who in turn was obviously communicating with them. So what that exposed was a fundamental or a fatal flaw in the way media worked, and media worked in that way because it had no clue about anything better. So assuming that, I mean, not to impart any nefarious objectives, but let's assume that they had no clue of what they're doing or were immature about it. So his whole point was, okay, so what are you guys going to do? So obviously then it evolved in a manner that a self-regulatory organization had to be set up. Right? Everyone was already licensed, right? Information and Broadcasting Ministry was already licensing TV channels. You can't launch a TV channel then or now if you don't have an uplink license or a downlink license, as the case may be.
And there are players currently who are struggling to get licenses.
Exactly, because of which they can't start. So, so this was where it started. Now, this was also in some ways the early years of television. If you see between 2006 and 8, of the roughly, I think, 300 plus TV channels, news TV channels you have, most would have actually come only post 2007 or so. Right? I mean, in between let's say 2000 and 2006, there must have been maybe 10 or 20. Okay, I've not got the numbers, but I'm just saying it was a minuscule number compared to the sheer number of TV channels that came up later, after technically the formation of the self-regulatory system. So now the question is, what did that self-regulatory system do, right? It was clear from the beginning that it was going to flounder because there were clearly players who felt that they didn't belong to it, right? So there was one channel who said that for me, showing the latest developments in the ghosts and spirits world is important news, and breaking news for that matter. There was nothing the others could do about it either, because there was no way to control. So when I look back now and I look at how, let's say, private television news has evolved, I think it's quite clear that self-regulation has largely failed. Now, what has not happened, and this is important, is the extreme event of the immaturity that we saw during the terror attacks, right? But we don't know if something like that were to happen again, how will online media behave? Or how will we behave? Will we show any maturity? Will we understand that by broadcasting stuff online, by using Twitter or using Periscope, that we are not putting out something that is fundamentally dangerous or will put people in harm's way? We don't know. Are we sure that it's not going to happen? I am not sure. So I think so now to sort of circle back and try and answer your question, I think there is need for self-regulation. I think it brings people on a common platform. It is important to be on a common platform where news is concerned. It is important also to signal to potential audiences, particularly discerning ones, about what you intend and why you're here in a serious way. It also signals in some way that you're not propaganda and you're trying to build a genuine news organization. It doesn't matter to everyone, but it surely matters to someone. And I think most importantly, to come back to the 2008 example, you have to be ready for events like this. I mean, these are turning points. The 2008 terror attack was a turning point for Indian news television.
And Cambridge Analytica is potentially a turning point for online news as such.
Exactly. The Cambridge Analytica controversy is a turning point for social platforms, right? Because now everyone is questioning everything. The free market is out of the window. Mark Zuckerberg has to go to the Senate and explain. If it was complete Milton Friedman-like free market working, then all these questions are non-relevant. Right? Information is out there. I've shared information publicly. I knew what I was sharing. Whether someone took it and plugged it into something else and found out and thus micro-targeted me is okay in a free market, is in a complete free market. So I don't think, so therefore I think we are in a slightly different world. And to echo what you started out by saying, do we have all the answers? Obviously not, because we are navigating. And if I may conclude by saying that, all of this, including the creation of the iPhone, Facebook, Twitter, is about a decade old. I mean, actually, if you see how many things are a decade old, it's amazing. I mean, the 2008 example I used, the creation of the iPhone, the WhatsApp, which came a couple of years later. So all of this has grown, exploded, imploded maybe, and reached a point today where it's obviously having tremendous magnification on our lives, our thoughts, our behavior, and we are trying to navigate something that has maybe spun out of control, but we don't know whether we should be using, let's say, the first tenets of free speech, the tenets of privacy. But I think it's very clear that all of these are under question today, and not just in India, but all over the world.
So in that context, isn't self-regulation a means to allowing regulation or creation of a code of conduct that enables regulation? And then, because the internet is different from every other medium, right? It's an interactive medium, number one. Number two, it is anyone can, like one of the arguments that we made during net neutrality was, you can create 1 billion TV channels online, whereas the TV is regulated, right? So then, is it also a situation where regulation is being used as a tool to keep out certain people? How does this work? I mean, my basic point is that then, if let's say 20 of you band together to create an association and say these are the codes that we will follow, who are you to decide what is news, what is not, what are the norms, what are not? What about everyone else out there who creates, who actually, let's say, live streams an incident that's happening? How do you define news in today's day and age?
So nothing stops people from live streaming what they want to live stream. So let me give you the extreme example again, right? So Facebook has hired or is hiring 10,000 people to monitor content on their website. Unthinkable 5 years ago. Why are they doing it? Because among other things, people are committing suicide real time on Facebook. So now the thing is, should we ignore it because, after all, it's his or her right to commit suicide and therefore we should ignore it? Or am I liable to not just catch it while it's happening, but also inform law enforcement authorities to respond? I think all the thinking seems to be on this side now. So we have unfortunately or fortunately reached a point where what we thought we could take for granted, we cannot. What we assume as complete free speech and complete freedom of will to do what they want, we cannot. In contrast, some of us want to build quote-unquote serious organizations. We want to build our own little brand, our niche. We want to connect with audiences. We want to bring about change. I mean, some of the things I do is because I feel that we genuinely need to improve the quality of public discourse. And our approach is to use data to tell stories and so on. So there is the institutional and there is the individual. So individuals today, perhaps you cannot bring them under your ambit, but institutions surely because your own survival or future may depend on it, it may cause you to come band together. If you want to remain an individual, by all means remain an individual. But I think if you're going to do the extreme stuff, whether it is spread terror propaganda or do something dramatic on social platforms, it's quite likely that someone will come after you. So that's something that you have to live with.
So, perfect segue to Nikhil. You're the moderator, you're one of the moderators of a community on Reddit, and Reddit can be pretty wild. You can create multiple accounts, anonymous. You can have multiple, there are users and misuses of the platform. How do you deal with that mess? How would you deal with the situation if regulation came to platforms like Reddit?
So let's start with the basics of how do you deal with it. And there's a fundamental difference between what we have to deal with and what you'd have to deal with a news site and whatnot. I really don't know what's going to show up tomorrow or today. Someone can put anything, and is that content? Is a comment content? And if so, does the same level of regulation apply to it? Let's assume not, because it's inconceivable that you can manage that much. But at the same time, we have to deal with it. So we need our tool set and our ways of dealing with this are constantly evolving. And it's a very disturbing area because while the discussion on news, on websites is known, the way we are dealing with comments and what normal people do, what the discussion which is actually happening between people, that's blank. And the problem there is that a lot of the tools we're developing, for example, we're almost always going to be chronically understaffed.
So can you give me some examples?
Yeah, I'm moving to that. So for example, one of them, at first we did it manually. Then we said, you know what, you can't just let unfettered free speech, because inevitably people are going to start saying that person needs to die. And that group of people is unacceptable. So these are obvious hate speech. So then we start removing that. Then we build flags. Okay, if these words get pulled out, all right, we need to take a look. Do not let these things show up. And that's, again, a decision made on what is acceptable and unacceptable speech for a very large number of people today, being made by people who are not in that position to really have to decide that.
So to that context, how did you get to the point of deciding what is acceptable and unacceptable?
So this is a moving line. And I think one of the terms which I jokingly mentioned is literally fractal stupidity.
Sorry, what is
literally fractal stupidity? So we start out with simple rules. Do not hurt each other. Then people find ways to follow that rule and then find exactly where the end of that is. And then they say, okay, I'm not really abusing this person. So now you need a new set of rules. Okay, this is abuse. You cannot use these expanded set of things. And fine, that works for 1 week, you have peace. Then they come up with a new set of attacks. That, okay, you know what? This is fine. And you let this guy go when he said this. Why are you after me? So then we get up. So eventually the frontier keeps moving, and it doesn't move necessarily in a productive way in which you can say the job is done. It moves in a way such that when you're dealing with user-generated content of this nature, it's never going to be done. There's always some division someone can find where they split the width of a hair.
So you are like what it would be like if a state was responsive
very much
to feedback.
So. Very much so. In many ways, we feel that. And what's worse is that this creates antagonism between the users and us, because eventually we have to say, look, we just say no. We can't explain to you the 500 cases we've looked at and why we had to block this particular piece of news. And it sucks to be you, very sorry, but please move on. And then they get upset because you are effectively God telling them your online ego cannot exist.
Yeah, because you made the analogy with the state. It's very different. Reddit is a private entity. Its users have signed terms of use. So therefore, all the moderation that happens is perfectly valid and legit. There's no coercion involved. So, with the state, it's not like that. So we have to be very careful when we...
But there's a really critical point out here. What Facebook, Google, YouTube comments, and Reddit own are a public space. I do not, in my experience with this, I've realized that these conversations are essentially not suited ideally to be in a private space because this is where the public is gathering. So it's more like the village square.
I disagree. I'd say these are public accessible to the public, but they're not owned by the public. They're owned by these private entities,
Correct.
which can therefore set the rules of engagement and is within its rights to
No,
do
which
it.
has happened. So why don't you tell us about what happened when Ellen Pao got involved and a lot of communities were shut down? Can you tell us what type of communities or subreddits were shut down?
So there were, I'm not sure how many people know this, but initially Reddit was very laissez-faire. They said whatever goes, whatever people wants to talk about, it's fine. And of course, initially there was borderline kiddie porn, which survived. And as a more senior and more mature person showed up and said, you know what, this is going to be problematic. It's great for free speech and whatnot, and maybe it's borderline, but it's terrible for a private entity and our future revenue streams. This stuff has to go. And it went, and there was massive uproar because the community and their expectations were now in conflict with what the private entity required. And to be fair, very regularly the private entities are going to be asked to be doing the job of the state, or at least regulating content in a sensible manner. So it's not necessarily bad. But of late, for example, they've removed there's been another wave in which they removed a bunch of subreddits. So a lot of people who aggrieved were people who had subreddits focused on sharing gun sales. They said, why are gun sales banned? And I think at the same time, they also removed subreddits which were focused on escorts and so on and so forth.
In terms of regulation from a private entity, you've also had, in response to advertiser pressure, YouTube pull advertising from a lot of neo-Nazi and hate content over the last year. In fact, they went to the earnings conference call because big brands like WPP and Omnicom sort of started pulling ads from the platform. So do private entities respond to different kinds of pressure? If anyone wants to address that, and is there, and therefore to that extent, how are our rights protected from censorship by private entities?
You use the YouTube example, and it's a very good one because it's not one brand but many brands. Procter & Gamble pulled out of YouTube for a whole year and has come back only about a few weeks ago. And the reason they did that was because they felt their ads were being served alongside content which was clearly not, clearly objectionable to them. Now, this is something that people didn't think of even a few years ago. So again, if you look at YouTube's history, barely over a decade old, right? So it's all happened in this time frame. So now the question is, who's putting the pressure, right? So as as in the Reddit case, obviously there is some revenue model somewhere, and if there is a revenue model, there are people who are looking at the platform and saying, does this have sanctity, and what kind of sanctity? The same thing is happening. If I look at in a somewhat dispassionate way why Google, YouTube, or Facebook are reacting the way they are today, I think the reason is advertisers. Because advertisers are calling them up, maybe on a daily basis, and I've been for some time, and saying, what are you doing about ensuring that my advertisements are placed alongside the right kind of content? So because finally I want consumers to consume, and the right kind of consumers to consume. So and I think there is no other pressure point like money. Regulation, people like to fight back because among other things, it feels good to fight back regulation. But the moment the advertiser, knocks at your door and says, buddy, what you're doing is something that I don't agree with, then platforms have to clean up. So Facebook and Google are working on it. Now, where they've reached and how they've reached is something, it's a different discussion, but they're surely trying to figure out how they can clean up the act. The YouTube of a decade ago or even 5 years ago, where anything can go, including jihadi videos, is history. Today, they're working on, this I know for a fact, that they're working on major cleanups And this goes layer by layer, you know, so what you think is free speech or what I think is free speech is no longer free speech, right? So, and finally it's a private platform, so they're cleaning up. Then there's someone called Twitter. Now Twitter is perhaps, in my mind at least, is the last to respond or is still responding or figuring out how to respond to this problem. And I think many people have been pointing out on Twitter that you're clearly allowing hate speech.
I think Twitter's trying to figure out how not to respond to the problem.
Maybe, but but you know, so maybe they can ignore all the Twitterati saying what they're saying, but they cannot ignore advertisers, because finally at the end of the day it's a listed company and they have to defend what their revenue model or lack of revenue model is. So I don't know where the pressure points are. I mean, obviously revenue is maybe the most important pressure point, but that clearly to me is a key pressure point and will be in coming days, particularly on any platform wanting to be credible and survive in a sustainable basis.
What kind of self-regulation you've seen from the media in India, because it was a part of your report as well on
well, we've had very bad experiences with self-regulation with legacy media. And so I'll quickly run through a little bit of that. In print media, of course, we have the Press Council, which is a statutory regulatory body set up by an Act of Parliament. And it is expected to have representation from the industry as well as from journalist organizations and things. Now, it's a maximum punishment that the Press Council under the Act can give is of censure. So all it can do is to censure any particular print media house, any print media publication for any kind of violation of its code. Now the NBSA, which is the body for the broadcasting, television broadcasting, is a non-statutory self-regulatory body. It came up after the 2008 attacks in Mumbai, when the INB minister, then INB minister, started saying that there needs to be some kind of regulation, and then these bodies came together. They have a code, and there the penalty is a little different, because not only do they ensure that the offending, television channel has to actually apologize, but also give up to 1 lakh rupees fine for any kind of violation which is upheld. Unfortunately, while actually it's had a fairly good set of recommendations and orders, there's absolutely nothing that's binding on the television channels. So we've had one instance recently where Zee has refused to accept an order that it has to apologize for some kind of content on Gauhar Raza, who's a poet and physicist. Now, there's just no way in which they can be enforced. And about 64 television channels are part of the NBA, the News Broadcasters Association. We also have the general entertainment channels, which have a different completely different regulatory mechanism.
We've also seen channels taken off air in the past for a limited period of time.
But that is not through the self-regulatory mechanism. That is through the INB ministry.
Okay.
That is, and the INB ministry continues to maintain that kind of power. It can do that.
Have you seen any particular action on online platforms from the government of any sort?
Of course. I mean, forget about online platforms itself, online media itself.
Okay.
We've had 25 shutdowns of the internet across the country.
Well, actually,
in the last 4 months, and in the last 3 days, it's already been shut down in three districts in Kashmir.
So
I mean, that's absurd. And the interesting thing is that they don't use the IT Act. The government doesn't use the IT Act for these internet shutdowns. They're using Section 144 of the Indian Penal Code, of the CRPC, sorry. And it could be some, the most absurd thing is that they had this internet shutdown in Srinagar because there was a rumor that Shahid Afridi was going to be broadcasting some kind of an address from the Jama Masjid. He's in Pakistan. The man's in Pakistan. He's supposed to be broadcasting some kind of an address. And for that, there was a rumor. And because of the rumor, this was shut down. Now, my point is that over the years, we've been saying that if there is any kind of law and order issue, the district administration should be able to tackle it as a law and order issue. It cannot shut down the internet, but that's what it's done. And the worst problem is that, many people have written about not being able to fill up online forms for admission to various courses.
So just for context, there were 70 shutdowns last year.
Yes.
There have been 40 odd shutdowns this year already.
Yes, really.
And in case of Darjeeling, we have the longest internet shutdown in history, where in Darjeeling it was shut down for 100 days at a stretch. And people used to go to the border between Darjeeling and Sikkim, because they used to get a signal from, a geo signal from a tower in Sikkim across the border in Darjeeling. So I've seen photographs of people standing with umbrellas on a hill on their mobile phones filing, including kids used to go there to file for their admission form. So agreed that unilateral internet shutdowns is a censorship at a mass scale. And in which case what happened in Kashmir was that they shut down social media platforms for a limited period of time, and they just picked up a list from somewhere on the internet, and platforms which we'd never even heard of were shut down. But I'm talking about specific media entities. Has there been any notices sent to online platforms? Govind, are you aware of anything of this sort?
There were 2 internet takedowns in the last 4 months that I was looking at, and
which publications?
These were about 8 websites. One of them was about 8 websites, which was relating to some, there was some, I think a speech that Anant Ambani was giving in some, he was giving a speech in one of those Reliance dues, and he was being made fun of. So there were these 8 websites that actually poked fun. There was a lot of really, nice satire, some really good stuff.
There was also this controversy around the Congress party serving copyright notices
and the second was the
on YouTube videos, which was from Rahul Gandhi's talk in Singapore as well.
Yeah. But these are takedowns that, that just come because there is some sort of pressure by the government. But I don't know how many sites take down on their own. I don't think we have any information or anyone who's willing to tell us how much of takedown really actually happens by websites, by platforms on their own. I think you all should be able to tell us something if you have some idea, because this is information nobody wants to give you.
Tough to pin down because self-censorship happens on a daily basis now, and you don't know what is being self-censored, right? Because unless it appears for those 30 seconds and then disappears.
Yeah, and there's a screenshot.
So I don't know. But I think I would go back to the institutional and the individual. I think some of us who've tried to create a semblance of institutional presence in the web digital space, including yourself, I think I'm not getting a sense that anyone has tried to take us down or gone after us. I mean, at least I have not got that sense.
But I also don't want to be subject to regulation because it is that I don't need to get a license to start a website and start a blog, which is what I've done.
No, I'm not on that. I'm just saying that is there a...
No, but I'm saying if you want regulatory parity between what is happening to print and TV and the web, then that means I will have to go in and get a registration of some sort done.
No, I'm not at all on that subject. I'm just saying that the question was, has there been a takedown? Or have we got a call from someone saying that, why are you publishing this and are you removing that? Or suo moto notice served? That hasn't happened to us. And to my knowledge, to at least all the newer websites in the digital space in the last couple of years, no one has really got anything significant, but I can stand corrected.
A lot of the things like shutdowns and direct attacks on websites are in some ways nice because they're obvious. But so for example, what we have to deal with so there's basically an arms race going on between moderators and people who want to say stuff which generally most people say, okay, not to be done. And this arms race is unfortunately just never stopping. So we've gone from moderator time to lists which are run so that we can catch these things. Then we've gone to straight up rules which just say these particular things aren't going to happen. And now we have to deal with users who have been banned from your account or said, okay, this person is a repeat offender. Every single time they've come, they've said we will be good, and then they have gone back into whatever it is that their particular button. And then they come back in different alts, and they have multiple alts, and they keep coming. People have accounts which they have stored for 8 years on Reddit, unused, waiting for the day that they know that they will get banned, and then they will break out their alt, and then they will come on and start this. So now, I'm very concerned that we are on the cusp of starting profiling which words you use, so that we can keep track of who you are, and what sort of word preferences you have. And that's a very disturbing tool set to have, because that prevents everything which everyone else is trying to do. Because it's not just that the marketplace of ideas works, it's that consumers can consume content. And if we can spread and we can have enough people spamming the network with what content we want, it doesn't matter what good content is out there or the website is down. You can leave the website up, they'll never get to see beyond the first 5 links.
I just wanted to know that if you say you have a certain set of words, which are something that you will be monitoring. Do you disclose that to the people who are part of it?
We avoid, because the moment people know what words
they circle.
So generally it's a lot of, it's sort of the idea that you know what's wrong automatically, that you should not be telling someone to XYZ, kill yourself, or use particular slur words targeted at minorities, or leather workers, and so on and so forth.
But just to queer the pitch a bit, we strongly object to the state, to the government, trawling the internet and picking up on these keywords, and therefore also isolating and targeting users. Correct. Because we say that then that's unfair, and that, there's a social media lab which was inaugurated in Mumbai. I don't know how it's doing, but it's supposed to be something that the police look at and look at all social media. Okay, so when we object to that, because we know that the government is doing this, how then can we say that
this is okay?
Yeah,
right.
that this is okay, and that there is no transparency. I mean, it's a problem.
I think I'm going to say an answer which you're happy with. So the reason this is, we survive, and because I've actually had to spend way too much time figuring out how the law applies here. This is a private entity. We're a private group of people, and saying that this is our forum, these are our rules, we're a club. You really need to follow the rules if you want to be on it.
But we should know what the rules are.
All websites, when you use them, when you create an account, they have their terms of use, which have these things broadly stated. So everything there is voluntary. What the state does to you is necessarily coercive when they clamp down on somebody's free speech. When Reddit moderates someone, the user has created an account in the first place by signing the terms of use, and therefore everything there is voluntary, and they are perfectly within their right to moderate as they deem.
So do you have, in those terms and conditions, do you even have one clause which says that we are free to use the tools that we would like to develop to make
it's
these
understood
terms?
Because the entire internet is algorithms, so that's understood. It's stated very clearly that you shall not behave in these ways, and so on.
That's true. That's true.
One of the things that the state is supposed to do is protect our rights. So, how does the state ensure the protection of our rights on these private platforms in a situation where there are jurisdictional issues, where someone can operate outside the legal jurisdiction of that state, and yet that content can be consumed here? And secondly, how does the state ensure that our speech isn't suppressed through these platforms by a non-state actor outside of the jurisdiction? That's one. Secondly, how do people ensure that there isn't the usage of these platforms to suppress free speech?
Okay, I'll answer both. See, here's the thing. I am not, as a user, entitled to space on Reddit, right? The same way, for example, if you come to my house and you start saying objectionable, rude things, I can tell you to shut up. That would not be an infringement of your speech because you're on my property. On the other hand, if I try to shut you up when you are outside my house on some public property, that would be wrong, and that would be necessarily coercive, and that the state should either punish me for doing or prevent me from doing. But on my own property, you have to follow my rules. It's the same with Reddit. So when I block people on Twitter, they'll be like, but you're a free speech absolutist, how can you block me on Twitter? But hey, you're not entitled to my time or attention. You're entitled to say whatever you want elsewhere. It's not, and therefore, because that entitlement doesn't exist, because individuals aren't entitled to say whatever they want on other private platforms, but they can say whatever they want in their own space as long as no one stops them. So it's a difference between negative rights and positive rights. You as a state, your job is to make sure that no one stops me from speaking. However, you cannot enforce my desire to speak on their platforms.
Yeah, but it's not just about speech, because the state itself is overarching. The state is overarching. The state has a right to come into your home and, and police you or whoever, is an aggressor in your home. The state has a right to do
Unfortunately, it shouldn't, but
that. It does. And that is a right that we give to the state.
The issue is that by looking at this in terms of public and private, it creates a tension when the issue is the working of the marketplace of ideas. And this, ideally before the internet, we had a way of dealing with it. Now the tools which are available are not so much about banning information or banning websites. It's about marketing non-information and harming the consumers by selling goods or using the normal systems. For example, I can spam in the forum, if I'm malicious, information which is not true about XYZ party, and thus push out all other real news. This is not necessarily an issue with news agencies reporting. This is about a malicious actor using the new tools to automate creation of information and to saturate the market. So it's not the usual tension between a public right and a public space and the private right and a private space. It's about whether these old systems are able to deal with the current problems. And people have found the weak spots in the old system and are using them to hammer in control.
So it's going to be a recurring battle trying to address those.
It's going to be a losing battle is my concern.
I think, Nikhil, we have to take a reality check here. I think, see, why are we sitting here? The reason we're sitting here is because one day the INB minister woke up and said, or did not wake up on that day, maybe woke up earlier, and said that we want to do something about this space. And she was only responding to a growing clamor within the party and all its adjuncts and affiliates that,
And lots of tweets hitting her, asking her to do
Correct.
something about some speech or the other.
Correct. So, no, that is the real world. Now, in the real world, in my sense is that something will happen. So, I think we should also be careful about not getting too ideological in the discussion and say that, okay, what are we going to do that is going to maybe, I don't know if stall is the right word, but let's say, or create a counter, which is, so to me a self-regulatory organization is obviously a counter. Say that, okay, listen, before you jump on us, we are already self-regulating, and here are the reasons why we're self-regulating, and that movement that's already going on. But I think we should not underestimate the desire of this government, and it could have been even the previous or the next government.
Well, let's not forget pre-censorship from
Correct.
Kapil Sibal, right?
Correct. So I don't think we should underestimate the desire, the urgent desire of this government to do something about the online space, digital news organizations, and bring about some kind of control. And it's not that the control will be used for something else. The control gives them comfort. It's not like Indian Express is not writing stories or against the government, or the Telegraph Calcutta is not writing, some of the most, let's say, the best headlines against the government. But the government has comfort that if tomorrow it wants to go after them for some reason, it can. It also has the comfort that it knows who they are and what they're doing. So it goes back to the institutional and individual in some ways. But I think we should be real about this problem, and we should be talking about how we should be ready for real solutions and not get too carried away. I'm not saying we are, but I think we should not get too carried away in the ideological construct of free speech, privacy, regulation versus non-regulation, and so on.
Good actors self-regulate, but why shouldn't we do something, or why shouldn't the state do something about those who don't self-regulate from based on the norms that exist in society or are constitutionally the restrictions, reasonable restrictions on free speech that exist under 19(2).
So, Nikhil, my counter question then is, who decides who are the good actors and who are the bad actors? If you leave it to the state to decide that, for example, you were talking about television earlier.
Let me address that. So, those people who are in violation of Article 19(2) of the Indian Constitution, which places reasonable restrictions on free speech, those would be the bad actors.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with those restrictions, but even assuming you take those restrictions for granted, then why do you need a special law? If 19(2) already covers that, why do you need another special law to regulate content providers?
That's because under the Shreya Singhal judgment, the Supreme Court of India said that the internet is a new medium and therefore you need new laws for the internet. I don't agree with that position, but the Supreme Court laid that out in what was a defining judgment.
The Constitution and those laws already apply to all citizens of this country. So to say that there should be further regulation of content is just a power grab for obvious reasons. And I'd actually like to agree with him, and I'd say that because government regulation, the illustrations he was making earlier of why is Facebook acting the way it is now, or why are Google and so on taking cognizance of all this, is because the bottom line is it, because advertisers are worried. Why are advertisers worried? Because people are worried. This is a regulation of civil society. Why did Prime Minister Modi have to repudiate what Smriti Irani had announced? Because there was so much outrage and protest at it. Ultimately, the best regulation will come from us, the users and the citizens. The moment you say that we have a huge problem, yes, I don't have any solutions either, and we've discussed this earlier on my podcast when you come to, there are no easy solutions, it's a huge problem, but the thing is, as Indians, we tend to have this tendency to say that, oh, there is a problem, the government should solve it. No, the government will only make it worse, always.
I think, I absolutely agree with you that people should be much, much more proactive in calling out bad actors also. I mean, taking off from what you were saying. For instance, my big problem with Facebook and its kind of censorship is that it's actually worked against the people who report abuse very often. And there are so many instances we have of people who've been blocked, whose accounts have been blocked. So self-regulation by these platforms, by all of these, and I don't know how Reddit works or all the other platforms, but each of them have their own mechanisms. So it's not one uniform standard mechanism, and it can't possibly be, because each one will have its own kind of mechanism, and that's fine as long as it's said out there and it's laid out very clearly and it's transparent. And the mechanisms to do this is also transparent. We have to have those mechanisms at every level. Now, there is absolutely no way in which we can question a Facebook or a Google or a Reddit, I think, to question what kind of decisions it takes. So if you say the users have to do that, the users have to be empowered enough to be able to do that, to be able to question. That's when we can then argue with the government and argue with the state and say, please lay off the internet, because we don't want this area to be so hopelessly over-regulated. It already is. The IT Act is very strong and it already is being used. We don't want any more of this kind of regulation, is what we need to be telling the state very clearly. Now, we can only do that if we are strong about the kind of mechanisms we have.
So I just got a message that says that Ravi Shankar Prasad said that he supports self-regulation while addressing media and regulations at the Asia Media Summit today in Delhi. Okay, so that's movement. But Nikhil, any comments on dealing with bad actors and whether you want the state to do that?
I think I feel right now that the state will eventually come in, because bad actors are more nimble, they are more innovative in the worst sense. So for example, if you look at what happened in America, they just used what normal trolling does and they politicized it. You really can't catch that. I mean, if a bunch of people decide that this is election year and we need to start seeding Reddit and Facebook with this information, this is not sieved out with the current filters we have. This is behavior which will survive, and this is behavior which will change the discourse. It will subvert democracy, and there is no way in this. So the government will have to find a new way to deal with these kinds of actors, because they live in a space which is neither political nor private in our old definitions. So someone will act, and that's going to be a problem, and that is the space which really needs to be dealt with. Because for all the other problems, we have laws, we have controls which say, yeah, this is already regulated, why are you doing this? But in this space, this is the part where the new tools and the inventions of the internet are being weaponized. And that is the part which I am concerned that, on both sides, I'm concerned if the government decides to step in, because then they can use those tools to prevent actual discussion and criticism.
Absolutely.
And on the other side, I'm concerned because then other people can step in who are even less reputable than the government, who we at least have some control over. And all of this is happening in a private entity, which really has no reason to be transparent. And even as a...
Except market forces.
Except market forces, which is great if you want advertisements for Disney. But if you're discussing something like sex, well, advertisers really don't want to be too close to that. And that's a very big conversation in India, and I'm sure everyone knows that. So those conversations, and a lot of the, and to be fair to the people we end up removing, they have a point. They are angry and upset about something. So even the act of moderating necessarily says that you should not speak, but then that doesn't make that person go away. That just makes them angrier. And then they find each other. And then they use those tools to start saying, listen to me. And when we find more ways to prevent that, they develop new tools to make themselves heard. And in this incessant war, we end up losing what democracy is about. We stop talking to each other. We stop looking at news being produced as news to elevate our thinking. We look at it as a headline which is to be used as a weapon to throw onto them and say, look, you guys are wrong. And that is not how this system was meant to work. That's not what the purpose of the system is. And if if there's a weak point there, then someone has to stop it. And unfortunately, that's the discussion which is coming straight at us. I don't really know how we're going to deal with it.